I think this is a key passage. There are really some really interesting points on discipleship, which we will explore now. And this is the third time that Jesus talks to his disciples about his death and resurrection. He did so previously in 8:31 to 32 and in 9:30 to 37. And in 9:30 to 37, Jesus too told his disciples about his impending death. Then the disciples discussed who was the greatest among them. And here we find John and James telling us that they want status and glory alongside him. Jesus is talking about giving himself, giving his all. And the disciples respond by talking about what they want. We see through Jesus' repetition of details surrounding his death and his response to the disciples' greedy ambition that the disciples still do not comprehend. They don't understand. They miss the point. They do not grasp the bigger picture. The disciples are following Jesus, but they are falling behind. Jesus wants the disciples to stop thinking selfishly about their own status, their own power and prestige, and instead start to understand why Jesus is focused on his death and what it means. He needs and wants them to see that yes, he is the Messiah and he will die. Why? And that he will rise again in victory. It was also important they understood for the sake of others' discipleship and faith, as well as their own. Perhaps they're not ready yet to grasp the enormity of the coming days. Who would be ready? I can't imagine how you can be ready for something like this. Perhaps they are holding their hands over their ears because they don't want to hear what Jesus is really saying. For everything they knew was being turned on its head. The disciples just couldn't get their heads around the idea that the Messiah would have to endure death. As Jews, they most probably also didn't understand that Jesus would rise from the dead so presently. They must have been super confused. And it seemed that in 32 to 34, they were in a stupor, in awe that Jesus was the Messiah, and they didn't have any insight beyond that. But they most likely wanted to believe something was in it for them too. Surely their association with the Messiah was going to get them somewhere. Their pride played a part in holding them back in their walk with Jesus. And on their way to Jerusalem, Jesus and the disciples were followed by others who were filled with fear. And I just wonder, do they have more of an understanding of the severity of the situation? The disciples were more in awe of Jesus, his status, that he was the Messiah, and this was what they were focused on at this time. They did not consider that Jesus' death was part of his vocation. The significance of his death was not in sight. In Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, they point to an anointed messianic figure who suffers and dies for the sins of Israel and the world. Yahweh's servant. Jesus' death was clearly part of Jesus' vocation. And a question just to reflect on. Do we grasp the enormity of what Jesus did through the cross? Or do we miss the point like the disciples? You can reflect on this today and during the week. Does our lack of understanding stand in the way of following Jesus? True greatness is found in serving God and one another, not in tussling for power, Not long ago, the disciples discussed together which one of them was the greatest. And Jesus was clear to the disciples that all are welcome into his presence, that we are all equally valued in God's eyes, including the humble and without prestige. Jesus goes to Jerusalem as the Messiah who invites us all to come into God's dominion. And despite these teachings, the disciples need reminding constantly about their need for humility and servanthood, even amidst Jesus' prediction for the third time about his death and resurrection. In 10:32 to 45, James and John are focused on worldly glory. They want to sit either side when Jesus is king. But they don't understand Jesus is turning what the world says is successful and glorious upside down. It's about righting things. In this passage, we see the words, to give his life as a ransom for many, which comes right at the end here. The servant song, and makes the point that the kingdom of God turns worldly power and glory upside down and challenges human systems. This is what Jesus wants the disciples to understand too. It's not simply about getting through a bad patch and then on to happier days. This was about so much more than that. Mark knows what it means to sit at Jesus' left and right at his enthronement in 15 and 27. But James and John do not want the struggle involved with God-shaped glory, which is so different to worldly glory. Jesus' glory involves a giving over, a sacrifice. Jesus totally redefines power and embodies this in his death, a redemptive one. In 10:35 to 45. Jesus' suffering and power. Jesus' suffering and death are the prophesied victory of the divine warrior. The idea that Jesus goes to Jerusalem to die, not heading up a military campaign as a militarized warrior, is beyond their experience of how things work, and they are still to understand and catch up with the significance of what Jesus was doing. The significance of his death. And there is so much more than worldly power and glory. Like the rich young ruler, they are not ready to let go of their idea of treasure and power. They are not ready for the cup of sacrifice. The disciples then currently do not seek God's kingdom, but an earthly one. They want so much of the same old age. Today, as we emerge from lockdown, there is an opportunity to create a different kind of community and economy, one that is more in line with the kingdom of God, one that looks to the poor, those knowing injustice. It looks to creation care for the benefit of all. And a question for you to reflect on today and during the week: what kind of world do we seek? Is it more in line with God's kingdom or worldly ways? Perhaps this is something we need to reflect on and think about how we live. Tearfund and other organisations are exploring what our communities might look like as we emerge from lockdown and inviting us into the conversation. So you could perhaps look at their resources. If we want to be part of God's kingdom, then we need to care about what Jesus stood for as well. We need to care about what God is doing in our world today. We need to care about his peace, his shalom, his restoration, and his community. The others following Jesus were indignant when they found out what they had asked of Jesus, not because they were annoyed at them for insensitively saying such things to Jesus, no, but because they wanted in on the glory, the honour and the lights too. It's uncomfortable, but perhaps we see ourselves reflected in James, John and the other disciples. We too are selfish. The disciples were humans like us. They did not excel at discipleship. We can see that here. In the stories in the Bible, Jesus is constantly having to teach them the same thing and remind them. Many in the church today seek after power and struggle in their discipleship. Jesus tries to point out true discipleship, which involves at its core humble service. In 10:42 to 45, Jesus says, "Be great servants to others. Be great servants to others." And something else to think about this week. What does servanthood look like? How can we serve those around us in our church communities and wider communities too? How can we reflect God where we are and where we live? Jesus advocates for self-giving, a significant self-giving, love and sacrifice that is connected to victory. So, what does this mean for us as we intend to follow Jesus? It means that we try to turn the world's values and power systems on their head by giving ourselves to others, by outward looking to those around us, by sacrificing our time and holding our money and possessions more loosely. The rich young ruler must sell all, give to the poor and follow Jesus. How does that story challenge us today in how we live? So here are a few key points for reflection as we go into our lives this week. What does it mean to have a servant for a Lord? How do we define greatness and how we can attain it? Are we more self-seeking or community-focused? And Jesus' life turns worldly understanding of greatness and great works on its head through valuing self-giving service. Do we hunger for power? Are we tempted to seek higher things? I'm sure that we do, that we can actually see ourselves in the disciples quite strongly. And if we can just give that to God this week and to ask him to help reorientate our hearts and minds. Many ministers dream of a big church presidency. Even ministers struggle in discipleship. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love." And I love that quote. The blind man who sees and follows Jesus is Mark's model of true discipleship. The desire to understand brings us closer to Jesus. Through Jesus, our eyes can be opened. Through Jesus, we can see more clearly. Let us see, to understand and desire to follow Jesus. And I'd like to finish with a question. So what do you want Jesus to do for you?